I know it's not biology, but I figured I'd like to make a video on this, just because it was something fun and science-based that I did, and I did it for pretty cheap. I think I only spent a total of about $30 on this. So this is going to be a how-to video on how to build these homemade solar panels from defunct solar cells and everyday household parts. This video came in a little longer than I expected it to, but I'm going to have a too long didn't watch for you here, so if you don't want to watch 20 minutes of me rambling about how to build a solar panel, you can get it done in 2 or 3 minutes. Alright, let's get on with the video. Parts you're going to need: glass window pane, manufacturer reject solar cells, pre-tin solar tabbing, solder, a soldering iron, needle nose pliers with wire cutters, pencil with an eraser, tape measure or yardstick, some silicone sealant, popsicle stick insulated spacers, a multimeter, plastic sheet, glass cleaner, rag and paper towels, and some polyurethane spray. The assembly now. Clean your window pane thoroughly. Find out how large your solar cells are. Size of your window frame. Figure out the maximum number of cells on the pane. Account for the spacing you need between cells for the tabbing. Lay out all of your solar cells how you would like them to be on the final panel. Glue down the corners every cell. Trace out the path. Erase the protective white coating on these positive terminals. Pre-tin each of those positive contacts with a little bit of solder. Solder solar tabbing. Do this for every other one of these contacts that you've pre-tinned. Take it outside and you want to take your multimeter and test each line. Connect the rows together in series if you have roughly equivalent amperage. This now acts as one large circuit. Now you need to cut a long strip of solar tabbing for each of the terminals. Then you're just going to want to solder it on like you've done any of the other solders today. At this point, electrically, your panel is completely finished. Full sun, maximum 20 watts. Run a thin bead sealant around the outside of every cell. Put in your spacers. Take your spray polyurethane and put a nice thick coat over the entirety of the cells. After you put a coat of polyurethane on, you're going to want to put on your backing. This is the last step unless you want to paint, but I'm not going to be painting. Just let it dry and your panel should be finished. Thanks for watching. Tom here. So I recently made a solar panel out of manufacturer defect solar cells I got off of eBay, and it was surprisingly easy, and figured I might try my hand at making a how-to video on how to do it. Here's a rundown of all the parts you're going to need. A glass window pane. Optical quality plexiglass or acrylic will work as well, but glass isn't going to bend like those plastics. But if you keep the plastic in a frame, it shouldn't be a problem. You're going to need some manufacturer reject solar cells, some pre-tin solar tabbing, some low gauge solder, a soldering iron, any power will work, some needle nose pliers with wire cutters, a pencil with an eraser, that's important, tape measure or yardstick, some silicone sealant, any type will do, this is RTV sealant, a popsicle stick to spread your sealant. You can use your fingers or any piece of wood or anything really, but I would recommend using something other than your hands for RTV sealant because it binds to skin fairly well. These are some insulated spacers, so this could be made of plastic or wood, anything really, so long as it's not solid metal. A multimeter, a backing. This is a sheet of painted metal. I would strongly recommend not using metal, and I would recommend using a plastic sheet or even treated plywood, but this is just something I had lying around and it's the exact perfect size, so I'm going to see how that works. It may short out the solar cells, so I may just peel it off and replace it. Some glass cleaner and a rag and paper towels, and some polyurethane spray. Alright, let's get to the assembly now. Okay, the first step is you're going to want to clean your window pane thoroughly. This is very important. You don't want anything fouling the solar cells on the inside, or anything on the outside obstructing light and reducing the efficiency of your panel. So just take your glass cleaner and clean it like you'd clean any other window. Same for the other side. Do the same for the other side of your backing as well. The next step is you want to find out how large your solar cells are. Take tape measure them from one end to another. With that information, you want to take the size of the internal diameter of your window frame, and you want to try and figure out which configuration would give you the maximum number of cells on the pane. My window happens to be 23 long and 15 wide. You also have to account for the spacing you need between cells for the tabbings. So, and the spacing on the outside. For your larger circuits, you're going to have to run between rows. Word of warning before you start handling these cells, they are extremely fragile. Most of them are already cracked, halfway through. That's why they were rejected and why you got them so cheap. They're still just about as efficient, so you want to handle these very gingerly. They're essentially like cardstock thin sheets of glass, so be very cautious when you're handling them. Do not ever hold them with one hand on the edge. Be very careful with them. Once again, they do want to break, and they will break on you if you're not careful. Alright, your next step is you're going to want to lay out all of your solar cells how you would like them to be on the final panel. You're going to want to leave a space down the middle for your spacers. That way you can keep the backing from contacting this and any water from humidity beating up or anything like that. You're going to want to, if you want to wire this in parallel, you want to take these tabs and you want to line them up on the same side for each row. If you want to wire it in series, you do reverse rows each time. I have mine set up for series, and as you'll notice, I have the most broken cells up here and the more intact cells down here. So the amount of amperage that is put out by one of these cells is dependent on the surface area of the cell. So if I'm only getting, say, 3 amps from this up here and 3.5 amps from this down here, and I wire these in series, I'll only get 3 amps from the entire panel. So I'm losing efficiency. But if I wire them in parallel, since all of these cells maintain the same voltage of about 0.5, then my amps would sum and my volts would stay the same, and then I could just add a resistor and double my volts and half my amps. Alright, your next step is you're going to want to glue down the corners of every panel. So this is so that they don't move around or break or crack or anything while you're soldering them together. So I'm just going to take this RTV sealant, I'm just going to put a dab silicone each corner. So this doesn't really have to be pretty, you just want them to stay attached to the panel. So you don't want to fully seal these to the glass yet, which will be another step later in the video, because if one of your cells is defective and does not work, you'll have to peel all of the silicone off along with the panel. So you're going to want to do that with every cell. I would also recommend never using masking tape, painter's tape, duct tape, any sort of tape or hot glue on the glass, because hot glue will not stick to the glass, but it will stick to the solar cells. So you'll end up with a big chunk of hot glue on the end of your cells and nothing on your glass, which is a problem, and it interferes with sealing it with a better sealant later. So I learned that the hard way on the first panel I made, and the same goes for masking tape. So you'd think that masking tape would be easy to get off, because it is on pretty much anything you put it on. That's the purpose, it's just there to mask. But masking tape adheres to these solar cells like you would not believe, and it absolutely does not stick to clean glass. So once you put masking tape on there, you have to leave it on. I tried peeling the masking tape off of one of my cells on my other panel, and I absolutely pulverized the cell and had to throw it away. Alright, so just make sure to do that with every single cell, and you'll be golden. Okay, I let that sit for about a half hour. It's still a little wet. I'd probably let it sit for an hour, a day even. What you want to do now is you want to take your pencil, you want to trace out the path you want to do on your solar panel for your circuit. So I'm just going to trace out where I want to connect to for each line. When you start soldering, you don't need to connect every single positive terminal to the negative terminal on both sides. You just have to do one positive terminal on one corner on the opposite side from the pre-tabbing. So I would just need to connect this to this and then this to this, and do the same for all the cells. Now the next step, after you have your line traced out, is you need to erase the protective white coating on these positive terminals. If you do that, you should see that a shiny silvery surface is exposed. That's what you're going to be soldering to. You're going to want to do that for every cell. Alright, the next step is you want to pre-tin each of those positive contacts with a little bit of solder. So you're going to want to heat your soldering iron up. Then once it's ready, you want to take your solder and pull off 2 or 3 inches of it. And then clip that with the wire cutters under needle nose pliers. And you just pinch it in your needle nose pliers so that you're able to most easily apply it to the soldering iron. Now what you want to do is you want to take your solder and you want to touch it to the very end of your soldering iron. You just want to pre-tin the soldering iron so that you have a little bead of solder on there. And you want to take that bead of solder and you want to touch it to the contact and just let it bead up there. Now you're going to want to pre-tin every one of these positive contacts. Alright, you just want a little bit of solder on there. That way when you apply the solar tabbing, it's easier to get it to stick to the positive contact. Okay, after you have all of your positive contacts pre-tinned, you're going to want to take your solar tabbing and measure out a distance that seems about right. For me, this looks to be about an inch. They're too long and too short. And you just let the excess hang over the top of the positive contact. And you want to take your soldering iron, pre-tin it. You don't have to use as much as you did for pre-tinning the positive contacts. Get the solder out of your pair of pliers, then brace the tabbing, and then apply the solder. Pre-tin your soldering iron again, and you want to apply that so that they appear to have a solid contact at the moment. So then you just need to do this for every other one of these contacts that you've pre-tinned. After you've got all the cells glued to the pane, and you have all of the contacts soldered together, you want to take it outside and you want to take your multimeter and test each line to make sure that they all have good contacts and are producing optimal voltage. If you have an abnormally low voltage or an abnormally low amperage, you want to locate the cell that is the problem and you want to replace it. I don't have anything to replace with, so whatever I get is what I'm going to have to work with. This will also tell you whether or not you want to use series or parallel. Now I'm going to measure the voltage and amperage of each one of these series so that you can get an idea for what you're going to get out of your panel. I expect to get 6 volts out of each line and approximately 3 1/4 amps. I expect less amperage from the top than from the bottom. You're going to want to set your multimeter for DC voltage and make sure you have your contacts in the correct position, otherwise you will not get a correct reading. And you want to touch the red positive contact to the back of the panel and the black common to the pre-tabbed front of the panel. Okay, so I'm getting 3.2 volts from each line of panels. That's actually what I should be expecting. I forgot. You should be getting half a volt per cell, so 3.2 is good. That's better than expected. That's more than 0.5 volts per cell. So that's good. That means all the cells are putting out the correct amount of voltage. So now you want to switch over to DC amps. And that's just turning that lever and moving your contact to the amp position. Your amperage should be the most highly variable component. That changes a lot with solar intensity. You want to make sure you test these panels in full sun. You have absolutely no cloud cover in front of the sun, and it's best to test them at solar noon, which is usually between noon and 1 o'clock. 2.5 amps for the intact cells, and I'm getting 2.45 amps from the damaged cells. It's good. They're only a, what's that, 20th of an amp apart, so I think that's close enough that I can wire them in parallel, or in series, excuse me, without having to worry about too much of a power loss. And I'm getting 3.2 volts, so I'm looking at 6.4 to 6.5 volts maximum, and a maximum of 3 amps. So that should be around a little over 18 watts. 6.5 times 3, so yeah, probably a 20 watt maximum. So that's pretty good for just 12 cells. Now that you're sure that your solar panel is properly wired up and you have good contacts between both of your rows of solar cells, or however many rows you have, what you want to do is you want to connect the rows together in series if you have roughly equivalent amperage. So in order to do that, you need to take this terminal contact on one end and solder a tiny strip of tabbing onto it, and then you need to take another strip of tabbing the length of the negative terminal on this side to the new strip of tabbing you have on the positive terminal on this side. Lay that on there and make sure you have enough. Alright, now that you have that on there, you're going to want to solder this positive contact to that strip of tabbing just like you did with every other one, except you're not going to be directly connecting it to a negative contact. Do the same to the other side. Now you have both lines of cells connected together, so this now acts as one large circuit. Now you need to wire on your terminals so that you can access the circuit from outside of the frame of the window pane. Now you need to cut a long strip of solar tabbing for each of the terminals. You need it to be able to extend from the terminal all the way out to outside of your frame. Alright, now you might want to pin your solder down with something heavy like these wire cutters. Then you're just going to want to solder it on like you've done any of the other solders today. Now do the same for the opposite side. Forgot to mention, if you're going to be using this to charge a battery, you need to install a diode in here. You need to make sure you get a diode that is rated for the amperage you have. If you're going to be using this with a battery, you need that diode, because otherwise, when there is not charge flowing from these cells, charge is going to flow from your battery into the cells, and it's going to be released. A diode restricts the flow of electricity in one direction. If you're going to use this charge battery, you need a diode. You just take a little bead of silicone, put it here, seat your diode in it, wire the one end of your diode to this positive terminal, and wire the other end to a strip of solar tabbing that you run off as your terminal. At this point, electrically, your panel is completely finished. If you live someplace that has no dust and no water, you can just set this outside and it'll work perfectly. Just put it on a stand and point it at the sun. But since we live on Earth, and I live in the South where it is 70% humidity or higher every day, I'm going to need to make this waterproof. Now that your panel is electrically complete, you're going to want to take it back outside and check your voltage and amperage to make sure you're getting the correct amount of power. You should have the sum of the voltages you measured before, if you wired in series, and you should have the lowest amperage you had before. If you wired in parallel, you should have the sum of the amperages and the lowest voltage you measured. Make sure you are in full sun and that nothing is obstructing the light to your panel. I'm currently under a little bit of cloud cover, so my amperage should be around 2 amps instead of 2.5 like we saw before. I'm getting 6.45 volts, which is good. That's what I should be getting. amps and 2.2 amps, which is expected because I'm not getting full sun at the moment. With 2.2 amps and 6.5 volts, roughly, that means I'm getting, at the moment, about 14 watts out of this panel. If I was in full sun, I would probably get a maximum of 20 watts. Okay, this next part of the process is the most labor-intensive and tedious part of the whole build. You're going to want to take your tube sealant or caulking, and you're going to want to run a thin bead of sealant around the outside of every cell. If you live someplace where it's very arid and there's not a lot of humidity or rain, you can just skip this part entirely and just go straight to putting on the backing. Okay, so I'm using caulking partially because it's easier to apply like this. Don't worry about getting it on the contacts. Silicone sealant is an insulator, so it will not short out your circuits. I would strongly recommend using caulking because I used RTV sealant on the last one and it took forever. This seems to take much less time. You're going to want to do this with every single cell. If you see any cracks in your panel, such as this hairline crack here, you're going to want to put a thin line of caulking on that. If it's a very small crack, that's probably not necessary. The polyurethane spray will get it. But if it's a large crack with a very wide opening in it, you're definitely going to want to seal it with the caulking. Now that you have each individual cell sealed, you're going to want to put in your spacers. I did that off camera. You just run a bead of caulk down the back of the spacer and just stick it onto the window frame. While your sealant is drying, you're going to want to make sure that you have all of your cracks sealed and that there are no gaps underneath the cells. Any tiny openings will be sealed with the polyurethane later, so don't sweat the tiny stuff. But make sure you have no gaps wider than a sheet of paper. After you've got each of your cells sealed individually, you're going to want to take your spray polyurethane and put a nice thick coat over the entirety of the cells. Once again, if you live in an arid area, you can probably just skip this step and go straight to putting on a backing. But since I'm probably going to be using this in areas with salt spray, potentially, I would like this to be as perfectly watertight as possible. It doesn't have to look pretty at all. You're not finishing wood. You're just sealing it from the environment. I would put at least 2 coats on. If you have any obvious cracks, you're going to want to put a nice thick line of polyurethane on them. After you put a coat of polyurethane on, you're going to want to put on your backing. This is the last step unless you want to paint, but I'm not going to be painting. Just take your caulking, just run a nice bead down the side of your frame. Once you got your bead of caulking run, just stick your backing right on. Once you got the backing on and you got all the excess caulk cleaned off, just let it dry and your panel should be finished. Alright, now that the panels are finished, I figured I'd try and see if I can get a 60-watt light bulb to light up with both of my panels. I'll also give a power reading for the new finished panel, see if I can get a maximum out of it. These are suboptimal conditions. The clouds have been fighting me every step of the way, but I seem to have gotten a peak amp of 3.1 there, with an amperage of 3.16 and a voltage of 6.3 that gives us a peak power just below 20 watts. I'm sure if I had perfect conditions, I would be getting 20 watts. With both panels wired together in pretty poor conditions, I was getting 18.5 volts, so that's a good sign, and my wattage was normal, so I'm not getting any significant drops between the two. Now I guess I'll hook it up to the light bulb and see if I can get that to turn on. Moment of truth. I don't even see a glow in there. I know the light bulb works. So I guess I just don't have enough volts or something. Thanks for watching. This has been a fun learning experience for me. I hope it has been for you. I don't know what I'm going to do with these panels yet. I still need to get some diodes so I can try and use them with a battery. But hopefully I'll find a use for them and they don't just get covered in dust in my garage. Well, I don't think I'm going to do any more how-to videos anymore, but thanks for watching.